Part of this, too, plays into demand management. So, again, when you're looking at the example I gave of a finance system, we know that there may be a lot of excess capacity to that finance system. So the servers may be well over scope for what we would expect that they would need. But because on one day out of 30 each month, they are going to be maxed out when they're running their financial reports, and they may be willing to pay for that excess capacity so that they have it when they need it. But there are options then, if you understand that pattern, of balancing the demands and balancing the capacity and bandwidth that the finance group is going to need. To illustrate this another way, I use an example that's relevant for a lot of us who commute. Certainly in the Metro DC area, we have some pretty heavy traffic. It was made worse recently by the start of school. So we have, and this actually represents my own commute to work. So that's me right there in the green car. There are two routes that I have to get to work. There is one route that is actually shorter, and as you might be able to notice here, it has a thinner line. There are only 4 lanes as opposed to the 6 to 8 lanes that are on this alternate route. The speed limit is lower. There are several stoplights. You can see the speed limit on this side. Many people still continue to take this slower route, as you might expect, because there are tolls that are assessed on this side of the road, and not just, and they're high tolls, and not just during, at all periods, but the owners of the toll road have identified that there are patterns of business activity, and that during rush hour going east and during rush hour coming west, that they have specific times when the tolls are higher, just to manage the demand on those toll roads. Likewise, if once IT has become more mature in their organization, IT may have the ability to manage the demand by increasing the cost or trying to drive down the capacity demands during otherwise busy periods. I don't encounter this a lot, but I did actually find an IT organization where the web design group found that they were overwhelmed with requests for website updates, to the point where they actually started charging by the hour for their web developers. These were all in-house people. They weren't contracting externally, but they were able to manage the demand by putting a specific dollar value on the work that their web designers did. So just some ideas in service strategy that we can use to manage the demand of the IT infrastructure. The second activity that we have in service strategy is to develop the offerings. Part of that is just basic business analysis. We want to gather the requirements. We want to build value. So when we're designing or when we're developing these offerings, we want to make sure that we are providing good utility and good warranty to our organization. Those were the terms I mentioned earlier. We also want to be proactive. So again, when I was talking about the goal of value in IT and really getting a seat at the table when decisions are being made, we don't want to just be responding to requirements, but we also want to be staying on top of innovations within IT and being able to propose proactively improvements to the IT infrastructure and the services that our customers use. And here we have also, since we're talking about a service life cycle, a key term is how do we define a service? We define a service here by we define it as a means of delivering value to the organization by facilitating outcomes that they want to achieve without expecting them to assume ownership of specific costs and risks. So we are not expecting them, for example, to pay for a new network infrastructure every time we install a new network-based application for them. They assume that there is going to be an existing infrastructure onto which they can deploy additional applications as needed. When we talked about capabilities and resources, those are our assets, our tangible and intangible assets. So how do we develop those strategic assets? We want to continue to reduce risk and control costs within the IT organization. We want to increase the service potential, and it goes back to what I was talking about with developing the offerings and being proactive. We want to continue to develop those assets within IT beyond just what our current requirements are, but we want to be looking ahead to future needs. As we're developing and planning, we also need to, of course, as we're controlling costs, need to keep in mind our budgeting and the overall financial management. So we mentioned that financial management was one of the processes that's defined in the service strategy phase of the service lifecycle. So upfront, we need to be aware of and mindful of the budget of the IT organization and of the business as a whole. We look at this as the ABCs of financial management for IT. So we need to keep track of the costs. That's our accounting piece. That's one of the things that our IT service management tools seek to do, is to give us a better understanding of how much it's costing to provide support to the organization. So some things are easy to account for. So the nuts and bolts, servers, network infrastructure, any of those purchases are easy to understand. Software even, we have certain license costs that we can calculate. But it's also important to calculate the other resource costs. So what are our support costs? How do we calculate the cost, for example, of an incident to the organization? Once we have an idea of how much everything is costing, then we can put together a budget. So we want to periodically, usually annually, compile a budget for IT, which takes into consideration our plans for the coming cycle. And then finally, there's the concept of charging, meaning that IT requires payment for its services. We also often refer to this concept of notional charging. So for most IT organizations, they're not actually, perhaps they're not able, or they don't necessarily need to indicate how much it's going to cost for an individual incident. But they do want to have an idea of how much per person it's costing, for example. They want to have to give the business an idea that, sure, we can add all these bells and whistles to this application, but they should be able to, even on the development side, advise what the level of effort would be for a particular modification to an application, to a service, so that the business can make decisions based on those numbers. The fourth activity in service strategy that we talk about is preparing for execution. And in service strategy, I mentioned that we develop a service requirements, or this entry in a service portfolio. When we talk about the service catalog, we have to remember that that's just one piece of the service portfolio. The service pipeline is actually should be a record of any planned services for IT. So the service portfolio should contain not just the catalog items, but also any planned services. And also you'll notice here the portfolio includes retired services. So we want to keep in our records any legacy services or legacy systems to have those records available for support or for lessons learned as needed. So as we prepare for execution, moving into the design phase, before I jump in there, Nancy, any questions at this point?
Yes, I have a couple of questions here. The first question is, this participant is looking for validation on the Plan, Do, Check, Act that you mentioned before, and they are asking just to confirm that that's the Deming cycle. Can you address that, please?
Yes, so Plan, Do, Check, Act is the Deming cycle. As I mentioned, it's not specific or unique to the ITIL life cycle, and there's lots of information out there on W. Edwards Deming. Just to make sure I had his name right, I actually Googled it and looked him up on Wikipedia before this webinar. So, yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then the second question is it necessary for IT to be involved in business strategy if the business is going with a SaaS solution?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about SaaS, and I know this comes up a lot, was just working recently with an organization where they were looking to implement Remedyforce and only found out later that their organization already had a Salesforce platform. If you recognize yourself in this story, you may not be right because this happens more often than you might think. So they found out that their marketing team had already had a Salesforce implementation and they weren't even aware of it. Many considerations there. When you have, if a business is going out and selecting a SaaS solution, IT absolutely should still be involved because there's several considerations. I would expect that IT is still providing the platform on which, or the workstations on which this solution is going to run. They are still going to be the ones to support it. So, if all of a sudden something is not working, you're trying to, even if it's something as simple as, I have this SaaS piece of software, I'm trying to run a report to export to Excel and it's not working. Well, who do you expect is going to help you? I mean, the SaaS, the software provider may not be able to tell you on your specific workstation why it's not working. You really should have the support of IT. And even most SaaS solutions still have some configurable or settings aspects. Another important component of it is security. How secure is the data for this SaaS solution? Certainly the government organizations that we work with, banks, really any organization needs to be mindful of their data, and IT security teams should absolutely be part of that discussion. So all around, more and more organizations are going with SaaS solutions. There's cloud-first initiatives, but IT should absolutely still be leading that. If not leading it, at a very minimum, they should be part of that discussion. Nancy, any opinions on your part, on your side from what you've seen?
I absolutely agree, and you touched on all the points from a support perspective, from a service level agreement, from a service provider relationship with the SaaS provider. Right. IT is often called upon to manage that relationship, so absolutely IT should be included early on in the discussions about the solution as well as how it's going to be used by the business. Okay, so those are the two questions I had so far.
Okay, thank you. Just one last comment on that too. I know can be a hard thing because you don't always have that control, but it's really about the relationship and the communication that you have with the organization, with the business. Sometimes it's a dichotomy, the business versus IT, but the more that you can communicate with the business and work with them and get their trust, the more likely it is that you'll be included in and consulted on those decisions.